Hello. Today I'd like to talk to you about one of the foundational concepts for the study of archaeology, and that is the recognition of what we refer to as deep time. It's involved with the origins of science and any investigation of the past. Prior to the recognition of deep time, the ideas that existed before were essentially stasis, the notion that everything is fixed and unchanging. And this was based upon the European concept of this, anyway, was the idea that since God had created the world and all life, any change was impossible since that would run counter to God's plan. And in biology, this is referred to as the fixity of species, right? And in this idea, this way of viewing the world, all life is arranged in this hierarchy, a ladder of superior and inferior forms of life called the Great Chain of Being. And so the whole universe was the grand design. Questioning the unchanging and static, meaning motionless, nature of the universe was seen as a challenge to the authority of the church, first and foremost, and was considered heresy. A number of people were arrested and put on trial. Some were executed for doing things like translating the Bible from Latin into, local languages, because this challenged the authority of the power structures that existed at the time. And so all of this was it made it difficult for people to develop ideas of change through time. Here's sort of the idea of the Great Chain of Being. There you can see with God at the top and archangels. You can see the moon there, kings, the church, princes, nobles, men. Lion apparently is higher up on the chain of being than other animals. Oaks and pines are apparently higher up the chain than other plants. And gold, obviously, is closer to God than other minerals, apparently, according to this medieval chart here. And Archbishop James Ussher, who was Archbishop in Ireland in the late 15 and early 1600s, was his lifespan. He even calculated the date of creation as 4004 BC by counting up the begats in Genesis. And with such a short span of history, the development of ideas of change was severely hindered. It would be like trying to play an NBA basketball game in 1 second. You're not going to have a whole lot of back and forth. There's not going to be a whole lot of opportunity for great plays. Maybe somebody throws it from, mid-court and makes one basket. But that's all that's going to happen in that short a span of time. And so that's one of the difficulties that you have with this short chronology of the world, determined by the begats in the King James version of the Old Testament. It's interesting to note that today it is genuinely impossible to assert that the world is only 6,019 years old, right? Primarily due to the sciences of geology, archaeology, astronomy, biology, and physics. Quite a few areas of investigation. It's not archaeologists that are, leading the way on this. It's pretty much the larger body of science that has established that the world is far older than 6,000 years. The first challenges came from astronomers and physicists. You have Copernicus, right? And his concept of heliocentrism, 1514. Prior to this, the accepted wisdom was that the sun revolved around the earth, and the sun and the moon and all the other planets revolved around the earth, and the earth was the fixed center of the universe. When he used early telescopes and astronomical observations to question that assertion, he was forced by the church to recant. In other words, they made him take it back and say he didn't mean it. Then you have Galileo in the early 1600s, and he was arrested and imprisoned by the Catholic Church for the last 9 years of his life. You know what he was imprisoned for? Finding the moons of Jupiter. Because if Galileo was right and those moons orbited Jupiter, then that would mean that Earth was not the center of all creation, because that would be another center. And so they imprisoned him, and that's where he died under house arrest. And so you can see there's active efforts by the power structures in the late Middle Ages to resist the tide of knowledge and new information and science that really began in Europe around this time in terms of our version of science. Obviously, the Greeks and the Romans had science, but then you have the Dark Ages and the rebirth of science, the Renaissance, right? Rebirth of science in Europe really begins to come crashing in during this time period. And you have people like Kepler and Descartes and Newton with laws of physics, motion, gravity, right? That condition the natural world, and that explain observable phenomenon. Telescopes, right? You can see further. You can see moons around Jupiter. Microscopes, you begin to see, tiny microscopic organisms in a drop of pond water. Longitude, which is a whole story into itself I don't have time to go into right now. But these other technological advances began to allow people to investigate whole worlds, sometimes literally in the case of Galileo and telescopes, sometimes metaphorically in the sense of the microscopic world, never before imagined. If you think about it, microscopes actually are what allowed the development of the whole field of antibiotics and medicine and whatnot, because prior to the discovery of microscopic organisms as one of the main causes for illness, it was attributed to bad air or vengeful gods and whatnot. So if you have taken antibiotics at any point in your life, you have microscopes to thank for that discovery. Here's a picture of Copernicus. You can see here with the sort of geocentric view of the universe. You can see the Earth there in the middle, and you can see then there's the moon, and then Mercury, and then Venus, and then the sun, and then Mars, and then Jupiter and Saturn. Remember, they had not found Neptune yet, and Pluto hadn't been found nor demoted yet. Unfortunately, Pluto is no longer considered a planet. It's quite sad. But at this point in history, all they knew about was Saturn. Here's Galileo with his advanced telescope that he used to make these discoveries. Love the socks. Another thing that happens around this time is the discovery of the New World. By Europeans, not by people in general. So the Columbusing of the New World, as it were. He claimed to have discovered it despite all of the tens of millions of people living there already. Sort of like if I decide that I have now discovered Carl's Jr. for the first time, and then I write books saying that I discovered Carl's Jr. late last week. It would be kind of odd to think about it that way. But this event, this historical event, when the Europeans first made their way across the Atlantic and discovered the continents of North and South America, challenged the notions of the Bible being a literal and complete history of the world, since no mention of the Native American people is made in those texts. So entrenched were these ideas that it was a huge brouhaha in Europe about whether or not the indigenous peoples of the New World were indeed human, because no mention is made of them in the Old or New Testaments, and those texts were held to be both literal and completely true, right? So if they're literal, then there's definitely no mention. If they are a complete history of everything that's worth knowing, then how come there's no mention of these two giant continents and all of these tens of millions of people living there? It suggests one of two things. Either it's not a literal truth, or it's not a complete truth that encompasses everything in the world. So you have to give up one of those two things. And so this causes another crack in that wall of resisting new knowledge and new ideas. Here you can see one of the early maps of the Americas, most of South America there, and then part of North America, mostly just Florida and Cuba there. But you can also see where they've put Japan. They're off of, just west of Honduras, it looks like. And then China over there on the western part. And the Americas, ironically, are named after Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian map maker. Not, Columbus, not any, sort of native name for the place. So it's kind of interesting to have that as the designation for two whole continents. As more and more of the world got visited, I'll say, rather than discovered, during the age of exploration, though from a non-Eurocentric perspective, it might not be exploration, it could be the age of invasion, right? The amount of variation among living organisms became increasingly apparent. Also, really, really important is the recognition that change did occur and that the extinction of species was possible. See the dodo, right? See the impact of releasing cats and rats on islands and the impact that it has on bird species, etc. In these contexts. Look at the impacts in places like Hawaii to the native species after the arrival of people, first by Polynesians and then later by Europeans. So change in ecology is possible. Just look out the window here. All of these hills here in California, see those yellow flowers up there? That's all mustard. That's introduced. Those foxtails that get stuck in your socks when you go hiking, those are from North Africa. The tumbleweeds that you see blowing, out there in the valley and whatnot, those are actually Russian thistles. So that both the distribution and presence and survival of species could change. And this then challenges the notion of the fixity of species, of a static and unchanging biological world. You begin to get more and more scholars who examine this and really begin to address it. Carolus Linnaeus, the developer of the Linnaean taxonomic system that we still use today, it goes kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. King Philip cried out for goodness sake, right? However you want to remember it with a acronym or something like that. But it's kingdom. I'll just do us, for example. Kingdom, we plants or animals? We're animals. Phylum, what phylum are we in? Chordata, we're vertebrates. Among the vertebrates, what's our class? Our class is Mammalia, right? Our order is the primates, Primata. Family, Hominidae, bipedal primates. And our genus is Homo, man, and our species is Sapiens, wise. Although that last part is somewhat either comical or debatable, depending on how you want to look at it. And so that's how we name, that's why it's a taxonomic system, that's how we name species even today, and beginning to have a way of organizing all of these things. Because remember, the Greeks thought that anything that flew was a bat, or anything that flew was a bird, even bats, and anything that swam was a fish, even dolphins. But when you have a better taxonomic system to organize things, you're able to understand the interrelationships, things like convergent and parallel evolution, etc., because you're not just looking at things as they are, but looking at their relationships to one another. You then have the Comte de Buffon, around the same time as Linnaeus, and his contribution was this idea that somehow plants and animals seem to be well adapted to their environments. You don't see camels in Greenland, and you don't see polar bears in Libya, and you don't see cactus growing in the middle of a rainforest in Indonesia, right? So these different plants and animals had a match, had a fit to their environment somehow, and this notion of adaptation. Lamarck, another interesting scholar, he had this just so story version of change in species that was kind of amusing. The idea in his classic example was that giraffes were descended from species of antelope who stretched their necks a lot. And so if mom and dad stretch their necks a lot, then that means that the baby is going to have a longer neck, right? And so through time, he thought it was this acquired traits that would be passed on. The trouble with this is that no matter how many tattoos you have, your baby will not be born with tattoos. And if you lose an arm, doesn't mean your babies are going to be missing an arm when they're born. Just see Luke and Leia Skywalker, right? So the idea that somehow acquired traits would be inherited was partly because they didn't have an understanding of genetics. They didn't have an understanding of inheritance. Gregor Mendel had not done his work yet. DNA was completely unknown. Chromosomes were unknown. And so it was unclear how that process of inheritance would work at this time. But still, at the root, Lamarck introduces an interesting idea, that there is a change in species through time, even though his mechanism for it was completely off. You then have Cuvier, who comes along. His interesting sort of history there. Cuvier was a gentleman who believed in a number of interesting ideas, including that the bigger your head, the smarter you were. So if you had a larger brain, that's what would explain how intelligent you were. Part of this was because the guy had an absolute melon. His cranial capacity was something like 2,100 cc's. Average is like 1,400 cc's in modern people today. So he may have just been trying to explain why he looked like an orange on a toothpick. But the reality of this is that it does not track with what we know about modern humans. Above a certain threshold and with sufficient folding of the surface of the cortex, the absolute size does not necessarily equate one-to-one to intelligence. Marie Curie, for example, the Nobel Prize winning female physicist, she's a very, very small person. She only had about a 900 cc brain, and yet she managed to win the Nobel Prize, as did a couple of her kids. And so Cuvier's ideas should be taken with a grain of salt, given his track record on certain issues. Also, you might expect he didn't think women were as smart as men. You can chase that down. The idea that's relevant here specifically is this idea of catastrophism, right? He attempted to explain the fossil record while maintaining his belief in the fixity of species. Supposedly, according to Cuvier, a series of disasters wiped out life globally or regionally, and then the world or the region would be repopulated by more recent creation events, only the last of which was described in Genesis, right? So this is an interesting notion to explain the fossil record. This is a way to maintain a belief in the literal truth of these texts. Maybe not the complete truth. He had to give up that part. But interestingly enough, he is plagiarizing the ancient Aztec, right? According to many Mesoamerican, pre-contact Mesoamerican traditions, we are living in the fifth sun. There have been 4 previous creations destroyed by fire, water, wind, and jaguars, my favorite. We'll go into that later. And that after the world was destroyed, either by Quetzalcoatl or Tezcatlipoca, the two sort of yin and yang of power in the Mesoamerican world. The other one, like an upset 7-year-old who loses at Monopoly, just turns over the board and destroys the world that they lost control over. So this is interesting that Cuvier, in an effort to maintain his belief in the literal truth of biblical texts, ended up having to borrow sort of the ethos, the storyline, the cosmology of ancient Aztec people. Finally, we get to the late 1700s and the early 1800s. And this is when Charles Lyell is born and grows up and begins doing his work at a relatively young age. He's only in his 30s when he writes The Principles of Geology, which really introduces one of these foundational concepts. And if you remember nothing else from the last 20 minutes that you've been listening to, remember uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism, according to Lyell, states that forces such as wind, water erosion, local flooding, frost, the decomposition of vegetable matter, volcanoes, earthquakes, and glacial movements all had contributed in the past to produce the geological landscape that exists in the present. Also, these processes can be observed today, which means that geological change continues to occur and that the forces that drive this change are consistent through time. Though various aspects of the Earth's surface, climate, flora, fauna, and land surfaces themselves change through time, the underlying processes that cause that change are constant. Here's a picture of Lyell. Here's a picture of one of the early geological maps that people were drawing at this time period to try to understand the structure of the landscape, the age, and most importantly, the location of deposits of coal and oil. Because Lyell wasn't doing this work, Principles of Geology, as some sort of activist effort. He was doing this to better understand geology for the sake of industry, because what's going on in the 1800s during this time? It's the peak of the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines and trains and factories and coal and oil and all of those wonderful fossil fuels that we're paying the bill for now. But this was this huge technological revolution, but it had to be powered by something, because, a donkey, spinning a granary wheel is not going to cut it when you're talking about the kinds of technologies that you're doing here. So you need lots and lots of coal. You need oil. And how do you find it? Just by digging randomly in your backyard? No, you do it by understanding the geology and understanding where you need to go, where you need to put those drill rigs, where you need to put those mines. And that's what's powering so much of this drive. This is a very capitalist effort, a very pragmatic economic need to understand the geology of the earth, right? So that's really, really important to understand here. And along with that need to understand it for very practical reasons comes the controversial claim at the time, not now, made by Lyell, which was that, as should be obvious, for such slow-acting forces to produce the change that can be observed in places like the Grand Canyon or glacial moraines, which are the big pile of gravel and rocks that get pushed out in front of glaciers, the Earth had to be much, much older than anyone had previously suspected. Lyell didn't know how old. He didn't have the ability to figure that out at the time. But he knew it was way older than 6,000 years, because there's no way that erosion produces the Grand Canyon in 6,000 years. There's no way that the Hawaiian volcanoes can erupt, create an island, and have it erode as much as the western islands like Lanai and Kauai. It's just not possible for that much change to occur in that short a span of time. This is the notion of deep time that this lecture is titled after. And it demands a much greater time frame of history. And that much greater time frame of history permits the depth of time necessary for the inherently slow process of evolutionary change and even historical change with human history. How do you get people from one spot on the planet to every other continent in only 6,000 years? How do you go from 2 people, according to the texts, to 7 billion in 6,000 years? It's really, really difficult to imagine that kind of math, especially given the Black Death and smallpox and wars and famine and hurricanes and earthquakes and all of that. It's hard to calculate how you would be able to do that given what we know about the standard reproductive rates of people. Also, genetic factors involved there. So it is about giving us space to figure out how all of this happened. It doesn't say specifically what, it doesn't say specifically how, it just says there's more space, there's more time involved here to figure out how all of this is occurring. And this idea comes, and then you have Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population, which he states that populations always grow faster than food supply in animals and people oftentimes. And because of that, there's competition between species in a given environment. And some will survive and some will not survive. Alfred Russel Wallace was a young scholar who was living in Indonesia at the time, and he wrote a letter of correspondence to an older scholar who had gone on this journey decades earlier around the world and collected all kinds of interesting data from places like the Galapagos. And Alfred Russel Wallace wrote this letter to Charles Darwin and said, hey, I have this idea that maybe species change through time, and it's about adaptation and competition, and it could be this really interesting idea that would revolutionize biology. And so the older scholar, Charles Darwin, went out and published in 1859 On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. He wasn't planning on doing that. He wasn't planning on publishing the book because his wife was a very devout Christian and he did not want to upset his wife. And so he was not going to publish this book until this younger scholar looked like he was going to beat him to the fame and recognition standing. And so we talk about Darwin. We might very easily have been talking about Alfred Russel Wallace instead of Darwin, had Wallace not written the letter to Darwin and told him he was planning on publishing on it. And so the idea there is to indicate it wasn't just one person's random idea. This was an idea that was beginning to bubble up. He had these ideas earlier but hadn't published on them if you look at his journals. And then Wallace was coming up with these ideas, and if he hadn't done it, because the information, the data, the observations were becoming so many that they needed to be explained because they could not be explained by the available ideas and concepts and theories of the time. And so you have to come up with new ideas and concepts to explain more and more information as you get it. Just like people 100 years ago didn't have theories of the impact of social media because there wasn't any social media at the time, so they didn't have to worry about the impact of social media. Now you have scholars who specialize in trying to understand things like that. Same sort of thing is going on here, just with a different aspect of human inquiry. So that's the thing. What is the nature of human inquiry? In much of the way we're going to approach the data from this class, we're going to be using science. We'll also be using oral histories. We'll also be using documents and art. But a lot of this is still subject to some of the foundational concepts of scientific inquiry. First and foremost, science is based on an empirical approach. It is based upon observations or experiments that provide data that relate to one or several problems or questions under investigation. Data are the recorded observations obtained through such investigations or experiments. And remember, data is always plural, except in Star Trek: The Next Generation, where he's an android. But anyway, scientific method is used to organize the research and assure that it is conducted in a systematic and logical sequence. When making use of the scientific method, a research problem is first identified, and information is then gathered to aid in its solution. Different kinds of data can be collected and range from quantitative to qualitative. Quantitative data, numbers, right? Things that can be expressed numerically, length, width, distance, time, etc. Qualitative data are those which are not well expressed numerically, such as texture, elegance, hue in single dimensions, or the species to which a particular fossil belongs as a multidimensional example. Even in sabermetrics with baseball, right? Figuring out all of these different statistics of pitchers and wins above replacement and everything else. There are certain things that are really hard to quantify. Like, how do you actually quantify heart? How do you quantify, not giving up, when your team is down? That's a really hard thing to come up with as a quantitative measure. But you can see, through time, if you look at the histories, if you look at all of these things, what the motivation, what is it that's driving people? Like, there is no quantitative measure of the impact of Jackie Robinson on baseball, but it definitely has a qualitative effect that you can talk about and understand. So these are two different kinds of data, but they're both data. The sequence of research, as I already alluded to, is the identification of the problem. Has to be done first. What is it that we're trying to understand? You then design a research program to obtain data capable of addressing the problem, right? Galileo looked through his telescope at Jupiter and saw these moons, and then, wait, what are those, or what are these things, that I see in the telescope around Jupiter? And then he collected more data and identified the problem. What are these things? And then figured out, well, I'm going to hypothesize, generating a hypothesis that these are moons, if they're not explainable by anything else. And you scientifically test the hypothesis through the collection of additional data. These data are evaluated to determine whether or not they can also be explained by the original hypothesis. If the original hypothesis is shown to be incapable of explaining the new data, then it may be rejected or modified. If it is modified, then you collect data to test a new version of the hypothesis, and so on and so forth, right? If a hypothesis consistently stands up to repeated testing and cannot be falsified, then it may become accepted as a theory. Unfortunately, in common parlance today, people completely overuse the term theory. They use it for any random idea that anybody's, oh, I've got a theory about that. No, you don't. Not unless you've gone through a rigorous process of hypothesis testing and can show your work. There's no theory. Theories are things like gravity, right? Because until very recently, we weren't able to actually see gravity, right? We were not able to see the waves of gravity. We have hypothesized that they must exist and talked about things like gravitons and all of that, but nobody had ever actually been able to measure and see the waves of gravity. Until very recently, two large 4-kilometer long L-shaped detectors, one in Washington State and one in Louisiana, actually detected the waves from the collision of two supermassive black holes. That's how strong something had to be for us to see it, this far away. But, until then, it had never actually been observed. We could see the effect. We could sit here and drop stuff all day long. Newton had ideas about it. What's causing this action at a distance, right? The attraction of one mass to another. So gravity is a theory, right? It's, I think sometimes people say, oh, well, that's just a theory. It's annoying for scientists to hear that because, most of the things that we talk about are well-supported hypotheses rather than actual true scientific theories. The use of scientific method helps researchers to minimize potential bias that may influence the results of the investigation. It can never be completely eliminated, but it can be explicitly recognized and addressed by the researchers and their colleagues. It should be recognized that establishing truth with a capital T cannot be achieved by the scientific method. However, it can generate increasingly accurate, consistent, and complete descriptions and explanations of ourselves and the world around us. The real nature of science is its capacity to improve over time. As we achieve new breakthroughs and discoveries, science adapts and changes its perspectives to accommodate and account for the new data and ideas. So, bringing this, narrowing it down from the general to more specific here, and the origins of the investigation of human societies. This begins as far back as we know of, all the way back in terms of the earliest written documents. People are talking about these things. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example. So people have always been fascinated by what happened long ago and what happened way over there. And so you see these archaic tales of far-off lands, sea serpents, Atlantis, right? We'll talk more about that later in class, based largely on mythology and cultural norms. And those have been around forever. In terms of the European tradition of investigating human societies, you have the next kind of phase of that was actual explorers and missionaries documenting, sometimes with some exaggerations, but sometimes reasonably accurately, these other places that they would go to, and producing the first kind of records of these journeys and trips and whatnot. Then you have colonial administrations coming in, particularly the English in places like Africa, the Spanish, Africa and India for the British, the Spanish in the New World, creating extensive documents about the local people, their traditions, and how different they were from European traditions. But unfortunately, in most of those instances, the purpose for documenting these things was to figure out better ways to control, colonize, and exploit the local populations. And so there's a different motivation for a lot of this information collection. Not every single individual. There were some Jesuit priests that were, all right. There were some people over here and people over, occasionally. But generally speaking, this was not the motivation for the majority of the colonial administrations and colonial administrators, explorers, missionaries, conquistadors, for collecting this information. And so that needs to be acknowledged when we use these as sources. It was not until Franz Boas, who we'll talk about here in a second, that the goal became linked to beneficial results for the indigenous people themselves rather than the colonial masters. Today, anthropology is one of the most active disciplines in working for social and economic justice on a global scale. Rewinding it a little bit, one of the first anthropological hypotheses, right? Ideas, concepts that was widely published and was even talked about in the halls of government in different countries was that put forth by these two gentlemen, E.B. Tyler on the left and Lewis Henry Morgan on the right. And their idea was that of unilinear cultural evolution, right? This was the first anthropological theory. I should definitely put that in quotation marks, right? It's not. But very, very wrong. It proposed that all cultures develop along a single path. And this being the 19th century, the notion was that it was based on technology. You have lower savagery if you have fire. If you have fishing, you're a middle savage. If you have the bow and arrow, you are an upper savage. If you go to night school and learn how to make pottery, then you can be a lower barbarian. Middle barbarism comes with agriculture, and you get to be an upper barbarian, much like our former governor, Arnold, with the ironworking, because the first movie he was in was Pumping Iron. I don't know if you knew that, but so Conan, anyway. So, and then to be a civilization, we'll get to this in a second, you had to have a particular kind of writing. The other thing was you couldn't skip a step. So if you had, let's see, if you had agriculture but you didn't have pottery, then you were actually still an upper savage, because it's like general education requirements, I guess. You have to prereqs, you've got to scaffold that, apparently, according to them. And they didn't really fully understand the sequences of history, because their knowledge of archaeology was incomplete at this point. So they got a lot of these things wrong. Also, the whole notion was one that was very, very flawed at its very core. And that's that first word in the title there, unilinear. Because according to them, this was the road that all cultures followed, right? And when you got to civilizations, they decided that it had to be alphabetic writing for you to be a true civilization. And so Tyler and Morgan did not consider China to be a civilization on the same level as European civilization because their writing was not alphabetic. So 5,000 years of written history, the wall, the printing press, gunpowder, all that, not really a civilization. And then they also went and they also ranked all of the civilizations in the world in a unilinear line. And who do you think were the most civilized civilizations, according to Tyler and Morgan? Tyler was English and Morgan was American. Well, yeah, the English and the Americans were the most civilized of all civilizations, according to Tyler and Morgan. And what this sets up is any variation from that. So the English are the epitome of human cultural evolution. And that given enough time and given enough help from their colonial masters, everybody could be exactly like the Victorian British, right? That was going to be the end point of human, cultural evolution, was to be exactly like the English. And that's really kind of, what's the word for, we could say as an individual, that would be super egotistical. If we're talking about societies, that's super ethnocentric. And given the fact, the way in which you can imagine they applied these different categories of savagery and barbarism, this whole thing is also super racist, right? Because it all had to do with how different you were from the Victorian British determined how far down the line you were, because it's unilinear. There's not multiple ways to get there. There's one way to get there. So if you're really, really close to the Victorian English, like, the 19th century Americans, you speak the same language, you're all Protestant, etc., okay. So then you're close, so you're second. And then as you get more and more and more different by language, by religion, by, skin tone, then you're further down the list. This idea encapsulates so many of the things that are wrong with the Eurocentric view of the world. So, how did anthropology get saved? The salvation of anthropology started with this man here, Franz Boas. This is when he was really young. He was German and Jewish in the late 19th century. Not a great combination for him. And he came to the United States, shock of shock, wonder of wonders, because the opportunities in his home country were limited by prejudice. So his reason for immigration was very similar to a lot of people in this country. And he was doing research with the Inuit in the Arctic. He had his education in Germany, but nobody would hire him at universities or museums because he was Jewish. So he came to the U.S. and got a job at Columbia University in New York. And while he was in the Arctic with the Inuit people, he realized that unilinear cultural evolution could not possibly be true. No matter how much time you give the people living up in the Arctic, they're never going to become like the Victorian British. You're never going, you could have laser pistols and X-Wings and R2-D2 and C-3PO with you, and you're still not going to have a wheat farm out there on the ice floes. No matter how much technology and time, you're not going to turn out like the English. So this whole unilinear notion, he knew that's not going to work. And in rejecting unilinear cultural evolution, he developed the foundational concepts of modern anthropology. Here's slightly less young Franz Boas after emigrating to the U.S. Right? And then here's old Papa Franz in the early 1940s. Incidentally, he died after giving a super impassioned speech about how awful the Nazis were and how Hitler was evil. And he pounding on the podium, and he had a heart attack, and so his last words were saying that, Nazis are bad. So if you're going to go, I mean, that's definitely how, a way I would like to go, talking about how Nazis are evil. That's a good last word to have. And the concepts that he introduced were ones that are sometimes misinterpreted. The first of these, and the one that often gets latched onto by people, is the idea of cultural relativity. They think what that says is that everything's fine and anybody can do whatever they want. That's not what cultural relativity states. Cultural relativity is a statement much like any other in a profession where you're trying to understand people. In its basic terms, it means that each culture must be understood on its own terms, and in order to understand another culture, one must not judge it by the standards of your own, right? And implicit in this is the notion that value judgments of good and bad, better or worse, assigned to whole societies or cultures have no place within the discipline of anthropology. Cultures are simply different than one another, and no culture or society is more legitimate or deserving of consideration than any other. For example, in psychology, if somebody's receiving counseling, is it the job of the counselor to say, "Man, you're really crazy. I don't know what to say"? Or is their job to try to understand what's going on here, try to see what the different factors are that are influencing this person's mental health, and come up with an analysis of the situation, an understanding of the situation? Because trust me, I don't have to belabor this point. Right now, in the world that we live in, there is plenty of judgment going around. There's plenty of judgment for people who are different than you. There's plenty of judgment for people who have different ideas, or people who worship differently, or people who come from some other tradition. Anthropology doesn't need to exist to add more judgment to the world, right? The reason why it needs to exist is to add a little bit more understanding. Now, when you understand the situation, does that mean that you have to leave it alone? No. If you understand a situation, and let's say you analyze the situation, you figure out that in this particular community there's a high incidence of domestic violence. Is that okay? No, it's not okay. Do we understand why? Well, we have some ideas about the different factors that are playing into this. Can we do something about it? You can try, and that's absolutely something that a lot of people do. That's what applied anthropology is all about, is taking these understandings and using them to try to make the world a better place. But the first step is not judgment. The first step is not pointing at somebody and saying, "Oh, I don't like you." That's not going to get us any closer to an understanding or any closer to resolving some of the dilemmas and issues that we face as a species, as a society, as a community. You have to understand the situation before you can take effective action. Otherwise, you're just shooting in the dark. And when you shoot in the dark, you're more likely to hurt people that you don't intend to, or yourself, and that's never a good idea in any situation, metaphorical or literal, right? So that's what cultural relativity is about. Cultural relativity is like saying, step back for a second, try to understand this. Let's step back. Let's see what's going on here before we just start swinging around wildly, and really try to comprehend this. And saying that, is French a better language than English? Is Italian food better in an absolute moral sense than, let's say, Indian food from the Indian subcontinent? Is Vietnamese soup, is pho, the pho, the Vietnamese soup, is pho better than ramen in an absolute, moral imperative sense of the term? No, pho and ramen are both amazing, right? They're different than one another. You can have one that you prefer more than the other. That's your choice. But is there a fundamental good or bad on those things at some sort of moral level? No, there isn't. Same sort of thing with clothing and music and religion and all of these other choices that people make, right? They're different. There's not a good, bad, evil kind of Manichaean sense for the different cultural variations that exist in the world. And even if you have your own personal preferences, it doesn't mean that the other ones are not valid. It doesn't mean that just because you prefer, Pakistani biryani, that means that we have to eradicate all other rice dishes on the planet, right? So think about it that way. That's what cultural relativity is about. I like my food, you like your food. They're both good food. They both have their thing, and they both can exist at the same time, and to understand them. Anybody ever work in food service? If you are cooking back there in the kitchen, you don't just get to cook the things that you like to eat. Whatever gets ordered, you have to know how to cook it. Same sort of thing. It's a profession. Anthropology is a profession. You're doing this as a professional investigator of human societies, either in the present or in the past. And so saying, well, I don't like that. Well, I'm not saying you have to eat this. I'm saying, table 4, wants a plate of calamari, so get on it, And so that's really, really important. This is professional ethics. Just like medicine, doctors have professional ethics. Lawyers are supposed to have professional ethics. I'm kidding. The legal profession does, in fact, have a set of legal ethics that it has to adhere to. This is kind of the professional ethics for anthropologists. And it's tough. It's tough. It's not easy. I can tell you that. It's not easy to always do it right, but it is necessary. The second one that Franz Boas came up with that doesn't necessarily get the same amount of attention or criticism is that of historical particularism. And this is the idea that each culture is the product of its own specific history, and that history must be comprehended and considered in any understanding of the current patterns of behavior within that society, right? The impact of World War I and World War II on much of Europe has conditioned, until relatively recently for I'd say almost 75 years, a greater reluctance to engage in large-scale combat because they had 2 world wars and they were good for a while, and that was why you had such a decrease in the amount of bellicose activity on the part of Europeans towards one another. That's why you had the formation of the European Union, which you can see is having trouble now. 75 years, people have short memories. But it does impact, the later histories of these different parts of the world. So, and however you want to look at it, it's also true that each culture is the product of its specific ecological and social environment, and each culture is presented with different opportunities and challenges that shape the ways in which people use culture as a tool for survival. So when you have people who live in a tropical rainforest, the solutions that they come up with are going to be different than people who live in the deserts of North Africa. And the fact that they come up with different solutions to different challenges and opportunities shouldn't really be that surprising, right? That's what this is saying. Historical and environmental particularism means you have to understand this particular setting. You can't say, why are the Tuareg of North Africa so different than the English? Well, I don't know, because they don't live in England, for one. For two, they have a different history. They have different neighbors. They have different challenges and opportunities. So there's a lot of reasons that you can look at that will explain some of the variations between different societies. And it's not about, they're less advanced or those people are primitive. You can often find the answers for a lot of that variation in the history and environment. Environment in the broadest sense of the term, including your social environment of different communities and societies. That often explains far more than any kind of notion of head start or decline or advanced, etc. It's often something that can be found in this aspect that Franz Boas has sort of pointed our attention to specifically. That's the end of this lecture. Thank you very much, and I will see you very soon.